500 people watched David White smile at exactly the wrong moment. That image would circulate for months. The screenshot, him mid-laugh, champagne flute half raised, turning toward the cathedral doors with the expression of a man who has arranged everything in his favor and knows it. People would zoom in. They would study the frame-by-frame collapse, not into embarrassment, not even into rage, but into something far more specific and far more satisfying, into comprehension, the particular, irreversible horror of a man realizing that the empire he'd been standing in front of for 5 years, smiling at, taking credit for, selling to investors and senators and magazine covers, was never his. But we need to go back, because the story of that smile and the wreckage that swallowed it whole doesn't begin in Miami. It doesn't begin in the White Orchid Cathedral with its rented grandeur and its 5-figure floral budget. It begins in the blue fluorescent buzz of a 24-hour convenience store at 2 in the morning, with a woman named Antonella counting quarters behind bulletproof glass. She was invisible. Completely, deliberately, surgically invisible. That had been the plan. David's plan. He hadn't just taken her patents when he forced her signature on those transfer papers, the night that no one talks about, that she never reported, that she carried like shrapnel ever since. He had taken something harder to replace than intellectual property. He had taken her narrative, in the version David White told at galas and board meetings, and over 18 whole rounds with people who made policy. Antonella was a footnote, a troubled ex-wife, a woman who struggled with the pressure of success, the kind of person you mention with a practiced, performative sadness that actually reads as proof of your own magnanimity. The kind of woman, he had told more than one person in the weeks before the wedding, that you invite out of pity, so she can see what a real life looks like, what brilliant, arrogant men never account for, what they cannot account for, because to do so would require imagining a world where they are not the most dangerous person in the room, is what happens when the woman they buried decides she is done being underground. The children were the first thing the guests noticed, 3 of them, matching black suits, black ties, shoes like mirrors. They're flanking a woman moving in metallic armor like she had been rehearsing this specific walk since the day she signed the papers. Behind them, a teal Rolls-Royce sitting in the garden, like a statement no one had the vocabulary to answer. And at her side, one hand completely loose, completely unhurried, a man whose name worked the way weather works. You didn't choose to feel it, it simply arrived. Stood Dario Valentine. Half the room knew that name. Half the room went very still in a very specific way. David White was still smiling. He had 72 hours left before he understood exactly what he had invited through those doors, and exactly what Antonella had spent 3 years quietly building while he was busy taking her credit. Here is how it happened. The night David took everything from her, it was raining in Houston. Not the soft, apologetic kind of rain that passes through Texas in April, like it's embarrassed to be there. This was a Gulf Coast downpour, the kind that turns the streets into dark mirrors and makes the whole city feel like it's being pressed down from above. Antonella remembered the sound of it against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Tanglewood estate. A relentless, industrial percussion that made it difficult to think, difficult to breathe, difficult to be certain, later, that any of it had actually happened. She had been working when he came home. Her home office on the 2nd floor was the one room in that house that belonged entirely to her. A controlled disorder of molecular diagrams pinned to a corkboard, annotated lab reports, and 3 open laptops running parallel synthesis models. The desk was a slab of raw-edged walnut, or something she'd sourced herself from a workshop outside Austin, before David had decided that their home should look like a spread in Architectural Digest. He had wanted to replace it. She had refused. It was the last thing in that house she had refused him. She heard him on the stairs before she saw him. His footsteps had a particular quality that night. Deliberate, measured, the way a man walks when he has already decided what is going to happen and is simply closing the distance between intention and execution. He set the documents on the corner of her desk without a word. A clean manila folder, the kind with the brass clasp. Inside, 16 pages of legal language that she would later spend years trying to reconstruct from memory because David had kept every copy. A full transfer of intellectual property, her VaxCore patents, or the synthesis process for the adjuvant formula she'd spent 11 years developing, first in her graduate lab at Rice University, then in the basement of the first apartment they'd ever shared in Midtown, then in the official labs she had built with her own grants, her own relationships, her own name attached to every application. All of it. One folder, 16 pages. I need you to sign these tonight. She looked up at him. The man she had married was still technically present, the jaw, the posture, the Brooks Brothers shirt rolled at the sleeves. But whatever had previously animated that face into something she had once trusted was completely absent. What remained was operational, procedural. David. She said his name the way you test ice before you put your weight on it. These are my patents. The company's patents. He pulled a pen from his breast pocket and set it on top of the folder with a small, deliberate click. There's a difference. I built VaxCore. I built it from a methodology I developed before we were even married. You know that. The lawyers know that. The entire board of the NIH knows that. The board? He repeated the word like it tasted interesting. Antonella, do you know what happens to a clinical trial when the lead researcher's marriage becomes a public scandal? Do you know what happens to FDA approval timelines when someone starts asking questions about the personal stability of the scientist attached to the application? She stood up from her chair. Not out of defiance. Her legs had simply refused to hold still. That's not... She stopped. She was doing the calculation in real time, the same way her mind worked through a synthesis problem, running the variables. He had already spoken to someone. The way he said it, the specific architecture of the threat, meant he had already moved pieces she hadn't known were on the board. There are investors who believe in this company because they believe in me. His voice was never loud. That was something people never understood about David White. He never needed volume. If I tell them you've become unstable, difficult. If I show them the emails from last March. He paused. You remember March? She remembered March, a period of 18 days following a lab accident that had destroyed 6 months of samples, during which she had written things in private correspondence that, stripped of context, what would read as the fractured communications of a woman who could not be trusted with something of this magnitude. He had kept them. Of course he had kept them. Outside, the rain hammered the windows with something almost like urgency, as if the city itself recognized what was being taken from her and had no better tool for protest than water and noise. The pen sat on the manila folder. The walnut desk she had refused to replace held the weight of everything. If you sign tonight, David said, it stays clean. You stay on as a consultant. Your name stays attached in a supporting capacity. A supporting capacity. 11 years reduced to a supporting capacity. Her hand moved toward the pen, and every version of the woman she was going to become was born in that single, terrible motion. What David White never understood, what arrogant men never understand, is that the moment you strip someone of everything, you also strip away everything they had left to lose. Subscribe now if you have not. It is about to get very interesting. 14 months after Houston, Antonella's entire world measured 22 feet by 46. She had paced it on her third night of the job, while the fluorescent tubes overhead hummed their single, tireless note, and the parking lot outside sat empty except for a dented pickup and the permanent ghost of a fast food smell that no amount of cleaning product had ever fully exorcised from the asphalt. 22 by 46. She had converted it to square meters out of habit, then stopped herself. American measurements now. Everything American now. As a new name on a new lease in a studio apartment off a frontage road in Beaumont, Texas, 45 minutes east of Houston, chosen specifically because no one who knew her would ever have a reason to be there. The store was called Quick and Go. The sign outside had a burned-out letter, so it read Qui en Go, which felt, in her lowest moments, like an accurate summary of her situation. The night shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The manager, a tired man named Gordo, who communicated primarily through sighs and post-it notes, had hired her without asking many questions, a quality she had specifically sought in an employer. The pay was enough to cover the apartment, a monthly bus pass, and the particular brand of black tea she refused to give up, because some things you hold on to simply to prove you still can. The work, objectively, what was not difficult. What made it hard was the specific quality of its smallness. Scanning items, restocking shelves, counting the till at 4 a.m., under buzzing light while somewhere across the city, in a glass tower she had once walked into, without signing in because everyone already knew her face. David White was sleeping soundly in the bed of an empire, with her name scraped off the foundation. She reorganized the stockroom on her 5th day. Gordo had left her a hand-drawn map of where things went, a system born entirely from whoever had worked the job before her, which was to say it had no system at all. Beverages in 3 separate locations, dry goods stacked by size rather than turnover rate. The cleaning supplies sharing shelf space with automotive products in a combination that violated 2 separate OSHA guidelines she happened to know from memory. Within a week, she had rebuilt the entire back room on a demand frequency model. Items that moved every night lived closest to the floor door. Seasonal and low-velocity stock went to the upper shelves. She created a color-coded reorder system using the sticky label gun and 4 colors of tape, each corresponding to a different supplier lead time. Beverages were consolidated and arranged by refrigeration requirement, then by margin per unit, because she had looked up the store's wholesale contracts out of curiosity and found that Gordo was systematically underordering the 2 highest margin products, while overstocking 3 items that expired before they sold. She left him a note about it, attributed to no particular expertise. He implemented all of it within 10 days and told her she had a knack. She thanked him and went back to the register. The nights had a texture to them, out here in Beaumont. A particular quality of stillness between 2 and 4 a.m., when the highway traffic dropped to almost nothing, and the only sounds were the beverage coolers cycling on and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere beyond the parking lot perimeter. She had hated silence once. Her lab had always been full of noise, assistants and centrifuges and conference calls. Now she understood silence differently. It was the only condition under which she could hear herself think without the static of what she had lost drowning everything else out. She thought, in those hours. Compulsively, productively, dangerously. The problem with the formula David had stolen was not simply that it was hers. The problem, the one she turned over in her mind, the way her tongue finds a sore tooth, was that his team couldn't finish it. She knew this because she knew the formula, the way she knew her own heartbeat, and the final synthesis step required a thermal stabilization approach that wasn't documented anywhere in the materials he had taken. It lived only in her head, in the gap between two annotated pages she had deliberately left incomplete, a habit she'd developed after a grad school colleague had published her methodology without credit back in her Rice University days. David had stolen the map, but the last 10 miles of the route existed nowhere but inside her, which meant at some point he would have to release an incomplete product, a flawed product. And when he did, the consequences would not be contained to his balance sheet. She was still running that calculation, still turning over the thermal sequencing problem, refining it nightly the way a sculptor returns to clay, when the door swung open at 2:47 a.m. and 3 men walked in wearing masks. The first thing she noticed was their shoes. 2 of them were wearing new sneakers, white-soled, unmarked, the kind you buy specifically because they won't be traced back to a regular purchase pattern. The third wore work boots with a broken left lace knotted mid-shaft, a professional decision on the footwear for 2 of them at least, which meant this was not impulsive, which meant they had, to some degree, prepared. Antonella's brain processed all of this in approximately the time it took the door to finish swinging shut behind them. Register. The tallest one moved toward the counter without breaking stride, one hand already raised with something in it that caught the fluorescent light in a way she didn't need to look at twice. Now, everything in the drawer. Don't make it complicated. She didn't scream. Screaming was a chemical response. Adrenaline overriding the prefrontal cortex, body attempting to summon external help, because it had assessed itself as incapable of solving the problem internally. Her prefrontal cortex, after 14 months of 2 to 6 a.m. shifts with nothing but silence and synthesis problems for company, was not in the habit of being overridden. "Okay," she said. Her voice came out even. "The drawer requires a manager code after 10 p.m. I'll have to go to the back to get it." The tall one looked at the other 2. A half-second exchange that told her everything about their hierarchy. He was in charge, but not confidently. The third one, work boots, was the variable. He was moving along the snack aisle with the restless energy of someone who hadn't fully committed to the plan, touching things, picking them up, putting them down. "Make it fast," the tall one said. She walked toward the stockroom door with the measured pace of someone complying, because the worst thing you can do when 3 men with elevated cortisol levels are watching you is move in a way that reads as strategy. The stockroom door swung closed behind her. She did not lock it. Locking it would read as strategy. The shelves were exactly as she had left them. Color-coded tape, demand frequency order, cleaning supplies on the left wall, 3rd and 4th shelves, organized by chemical composition, because that had been the logical system, and she hadn't, at the time, considered it anything other than good cataloging. Sodium hypochlorite, concentrated ammonia-based degreaser, both products she had flagged in her OSHA violation note to Gordo 7 weeks ago, citing exactly the kind of reactive chemistry that occurs when they are stored in proximity. She was not going to create a dangerous situation. She was going to create a specific situation. There was a meaningful difference, and the difference lived in concentration, volume, and ventilation, all variables she could control. But the store's HVAC intake vent ran along the top of the back wall and pushed air toward the front of the building. She had noticed this on her first week, when she'd tracked how quickly a spilled beverage smell dissipated, depending on where in the store it originated. It took her 40 seconds to position 2 open containers near the vent intake, combine them in the correct ratio, and move to the corner of the stockroom where the airflow did not reach. Then she hit the silent alarm panel behind the spare register tape, a small grey button that Gordo had shown her on day 1 with the enthusiasm of a man who never expected it to be used. The gas that began drifting under the stockroom door and into the main floor was not theatrical. It did not billow. It was the kind of thing you walk into before you understand you're in it. An invisible irritant that attacks the mucous membranes and eyes with quiet, clinical efficiency, triggering reflexive coughing and tearing within 60 to 90 seconds of moderate exposure. She heard it happen. First one voice, then 2, then a crash that sounded like the rotating hot dog display she had always privately thought was a structural hazard. Then coughing, the specific, helpless, doubled-over kind. By the time the Beaumont Police Department cruiser pulled into the quick-and-go lot, 7 minutes from silent alarm to arrival, which she catalogued as slower than optimal but adequate, all 3 men were seated on the floor near the entrance with all the purposefulness of people who had completely forgotten what they had originally come to do. She stepped out of the stockroom and unlocked the front door for the officers. What she did not unlock was her expression, which remained exactly as it had been at 2:47 when the door had swung open. Measured, assessed, solved. The officer, a young woman from Jefferson County whose nameplate read T. Broussard, looked at the 3 incapacitated men, then at Antonella, then at the men again. "Ma'am, what exactly did you—" "Cleaning products," Antonella said. "Improper storage. It's an OSHA issue." Outside, across the parking lot, a black Escalade with Nevada plates sat idling in the shadows beyond the reach of the lot lights. It had been there for 4 minutes. It did not belong to Jefferson County. It did not move when the police arrived. It simply waited. He came 3 days later. Not the night after. Not with urgency, which told her something. Men who operated on urgency were men who needed things. The 3-day gap was a message in itself. I am not in a hurry, because I don't have to be. She had spent enough years reading the behavioral vocabulary of powerful men to understand that the ones who moved slowly were always the ones you needed to watch most carefully. She was restocking the refrigerated section when the Escalade pulled in, the same black, Nevada-plated vehicle that had watched from the parking lot shadows while Officer Broussard took her statement. Antonella recognized it, the way you recognize a recurring detail in an experiment. Once is data, twice is a pattern. He came in alone. No visible security, though she suspected that was a carefully maintained illusion rather than a fact. Or the man himself was exactly what the vehicle had implied, unhurried, architecturally calm, wearing a charcoal Brioni jacket over a black shirt with no tie, tattoos climbing from his collar the way ivy climbs old brick. Not decoratively, structurally, like they had always been part of the building. He did not go to the register. He walked to the refrigerated section, opened the case beside her, and studied the contents with what appeared to be genuine consideration before selecting a bottle of still water. "The reorganization is impressive," he said, without looking at her. His voice was measured in a way that suggested it was always measured, as a deliberate practice rather than a natural condition. "Demand frequency shelving. Or you even adjusted for the regional buying patterns. More sports drinks near the front because of the industrial workers coming off the overnight at the refinery down the road." She closed the refrigerator case and looked at him directly. "Most people just grab a water and leave." "I'm not most people." He turned then. The eyes were the thing you noticed when you finally saw them. The particular stillness of someone who processes more than they speak, which in her experience described either scientists or very dangerous men, and occasionally both. Dario Valentine. I know who you are. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, closer to the satisfaction of a variable confirming itself. Then you know why I'm here. You watched the footage. The Jefferson County Police report had been routine, but routine reports had a way of traveling through certain networks before the ink dried. She understood. You're deciding whether I'm an asset or an anomaly. I decided that within 48 hours of watching a convenience store clerk neutralize 3 armed men using shelf-stock chemistry and an HVAC system. He set the water bottle on the counter beside the register with a small, clean sound. What I'm here to determine is whether you'll accept what I'm offering. She waited. In her experience, the worst negotiating position was filling a silence the other person had deliberately created. I have a facility, Dario said. Outside of Reno. Private. Equipped to a standard that would make most university research departments look like a high school science fair. It's been used for logistics work. I won't dress that up for you. But the equipment is legitimate, the supply lines are clean, and as of 6 weeks ago, it is available. The refrigerators hummed behind her. Somewhere outside, a truck downshifted on the highway. You're offering me a lab. I'm offering you the means to finish what David White stole. The name landed without drama, which was somehow more unnerving than if he had weaponized it. I've read your published work, the pre-VaxCore papers, the Rice University methodology, the Phase 2 adjuvant trials you ran out of the Houston Medical Center in 2019. What David has is incomplete. You know it. I know it. And within 18 months, when he tries to push that product through final FDA review, the people responsible for approving it will know it too. The weight of that landed exactly the way she had always known it would. She had been turning the thermal sequencing problem over in her mind for 14 months in the blue hum of this store, and she had never once pretended to herself that the stakes were personal. The stakes were never personal. They were 300 million potential doses delivered to people in every state from Oregon to Florida who would have no idea that the woman who built the formula had been systematically erased from it. What do you want in return? She asked. When VaxCore collapses, and it will collapse, I want the first meeting with the incoming CEO. A pause that was calibrated to the millimeter. I move significant logistics volume through the cold chain pharmaceutical network. I'd prefer to work with someone who understands what they're protecting. It was not a romantic proposition. It was not even precisely, or a generous one. It was a business arrangement between 2 people who each possessed something the other required, stated with the directness of someone who considered pretense a waste of everyone's time. She looked at the quick-and-go uniform she'd been wearing for 14 months, the burned-out letter on the sign outside, the 22 by 46 feet of fluorescent purgatory that had been her entire world since Houston. I'll need a full equipment list by Thursday, she said. For the first time since he had walked through the door, Dario Valentine smiled. It was a small thing, but it was real. The Nevada facility was not what she had expected, which meant Dario had understood exactly what she needed before she had thought to specify it. She had expected functional, clean lines, adequate equipment, or the kind of purposeful austerity that says this space exists to produce results. What she found on a dry October morning, 40 minutes outside Reno, with the Sierra Nevada sitting against the horizon like a torn paper edge, was something closer to reverence. The main lab occupied the interior of what had once been a temperature-controlled agricultural storage building. The bones were industrial, but what lived inside them was precise. Zeiss microscopy equipment, a Shimadzu chromatography system, she had written a grant proposal to obtain for her Houston lab 3 years ago and been denied. Biosafety cabinets that still carried their certification seals. A thermal regulation array that could hold a synthesis environment to within 1/10 of a degree Celsius. She stood in the middle of it for almost a full minute without speaking. The chromatography system took 3 weeks to source, Dario said from the doorway, arms crossed, watching her the way he always watched things, with that quality of attention that never announced itself. The thermal array was custom, built by an engineer out of Salt Lake City who does work for 3 national laboratories and asks very few questions. You knew about the thermal sequencing problem. I knew the published trials stopped at a point that didn't make scientific sense for someone of your ability. I made an inference. She turned to look at him. After 6 weeks of working alongside Dario Valentine, she had developed a functional taxonomy of his silences, his movements, the specific economy of how he occupied a room. He was a man who had built an entire operational life on the principle that information was the most valuable and most dangerous currency in existence, and he handled knowledge about her with the same careful precision she applied to compounds. He never used what he knew carelessly. It was, she had come to understand, his version of respect. The work itself was the closest thing to joy she had felt in nearly 2 years. Not happiness. Happiness was a different register, lighter, more contingent. This was the older, more structural feeling of a mind returning to the problem it was built for. She worked 12-hour days without noticing, tracking the thermal stabilization curve through 17 iterations, adjusting variables with the methodical patience of someone who had never confused speed with progress. Her notes filled 3 Leuchtturm notebooks in the first month, dense, annotated, cross-referenced, the handwriting shifting from careful to urgent as the synthesis began resolving itself into something she recognized as correct. Dario came to the lab most evenings. He never interfered with the work. He would sit at the far end of the main bench with whatever operational matter required his attention, sometimes documents, sometimes calls conducted in a voice too low to decipher, and they would occupy the same space in a companionable parallel silence that felt, after a while, entirely natural. "You don't ask questions about what I do," he said one evening. Not quite an observation. Not quite a question. "You don't ask questions about what I do," she replied, without looking up from the centrifuge readout. A pause, and then, "Fair." The children arrived on a Thursday in November, which was how she learned that Dario's organizational precision extended to every domain of his life, except apparently scheduling logistics around a custody arrangement with a former partner in Phoenix. 3 of them. Nako was 9, serious-faced, with his father's quality of watchful stillness and a current obsession with structural engineering that he documented in a small moleskin notebook he carried everywhere. The twins, Petra and Luca, were 6 and operated as a single continuous force of nature, finishing each other's sentences, staging elaborate dramatic productions, using whatever objects were available, and treating every adult in their immediate environment as a potential audience. Petra found her way into the lab on the second morning. She stood at the doorway in a miniature puffer vest, Montclair, Antonella noticed, in the particular burnt orange that Dario seemed to favor for his children's wardrobes, and examined the space with the frank assessment of a child who has learned that if you look confident enough, no one stops you. "What does that machine do?" she asked, pointing at the chromatography system. Antonella considered. With most people, she simplified. With children, she had found, simplification was often an insult to their intelligence. It separates things that are mixed together, so I can see exactly what's in something. Petra processed this. Like when you find the mushrooms in soup, even though someone tried to hide them. Exactly like that. Something opened in Antonella's chest. Small, careful, but like a window that had been painted shut for a very long time, being coaxed back from its frame. The feeling was unfamiliar enough that it took her a moment to name it. Not grief. Not its absence, exactly. Something edging, cautiously, toward the opposite. By the end of the week, Nico had begun cross-referencing her thermal stabilization diagrams with architectural load models in his notebook, drawing structural analogies she had not considered, and 2 of which turned out to be genuinely useful. Luca had appointed himself the facility's official snack procurement officer, and Petra, with complete unself-consciousness, had begun calling her by name rather than any formal address, as though they had simply always known each other, and the meeting had been an administrative formality. On Sunday evening, Dario found Antonella at the main bench, all 3 children arranged around her in various states of focus. Petra asleep against her arm, Nico's notebook open between them, the thermal array running its 18th successful iteration in the background. He looked at the scene for a long moment. Something crossed his face that he didn't immediately neutralize. "The sequence is holding," Antonella said, quietly, so as not to wake Petra. "I can see that," Dario said, but he wasn't looking at the readout. 2 days later, a cream envelope arrived at the facility with a Miami postmark. No return address. Inside, a single card, thick cotton stock, embossed lettering, the specific weight of something that had been chosen to impress. A wedding invitation. David White and fiancé, black tie, 4 weeks hence. And in David's own handwriting, there's across the bottom margin 5 words that he had clearly intended as the final word on everything. "Thought you should see this." Antonella read it once, set it on the bench, looked at the thermal stabilization readout, confirming that her formula, her completed, perfected, undeniable formula, was exactly what she had always known it would be. Then she went to find Dario. "It's getting interesting over here. I need you to subscribe now if you haven't. Do that now before we continue." "Okay, let's continue." She found him in the facility's side room that served as his operational office, a converted storage space he had furnished with the same deliberate minimalism he applied to everything. A single restoration hardware desk in reclaimed elm, 2 monitors, a leather chair the color of dark espresso. A room that said, "Decisions are made here, not impressions." Antonella set the invitation on the desk in front of him without preamble. Dario read it once, turned it over, examined the back, set it down. Then he picked it up and read David's handwritten annotation a second time with the focused attention of a man cataloging the full tactical content of a document before responding to any of it emotionally. "He sent it to the Nevada address," he said. Yes, that single fact carried more weight than the invitation itself, and they both understood it. David knew she had left Beaumont. David had found a thread of her new location, which meant he had resources working on her whereabouts, which meant the anonymity she had been operating inside for 14 months was thinner than she had constructed it to be. Dario set the card down on the desk with the same precise, unhurried motion he used for everything. "How long have you known he was looking?" Antonella asked. 3 weeks. His people are competent, but not invisible. He said it without apology, as a factual update, rather than a confession of withheld information. "I wanted to know how much he'd found before I told you. The answer is the Nevada address. Nothing else. The lab itself is clean." She pulled the second chair from the corner and sat down. Outside, the desert dark had settled completely over the scrubland surrounding the facility, and the only sound was the faint cycling of the thermal array in the adjacent room, running its overnight stabilization sequence like a slow, steady heartbeat. "He wrote those 5 words because he wants me to feel it," she said. "He wants me sitting in whatever he imagines my situation to be, holding a card I can't afford to respond to, watching him from a distance. And instead you walked in here holding it like evidence. Because that's what it is." Dario leaned back in the espresso chair and looked at the invitation with the expression she had come to recognize as his problem-solving face. Not cold, exactly, but stripped of everything that wasn't relevant. "Tell me what's in Miami, beyond the wedding." She had already done this accounting in the 40 steps between the lab bench and this room. His lead investors, the VaxCore board members he's been cultivating since he took the company public. There are 4 of them based out of Miami and Palm Beach. The FDA liaison he's been socializing for the past 18 months is a personal friend of the family hosting the venue. She paused. He built the guest list as a demonstration. Everyone in that room is someone he wants to believe that VaxCore is untouchable. So the wedding isn't a wedding. The wedding is a shareholder confidence event with a ceremony attached. Something shifted in Dario's expression. Not a smile, more the quality of stillness that precedes one. He picked up the invitation again and held it between 2 fingers, studying David's handwriting across the bottom margin, the way a jeweler studies a stone for its flaw rather than its facets. "Then we don't attend a wedding," he said. He set the card down and looked at her directly. "If he wants a show, let's give him a finale." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Antonella understood immediately what he meant, and more importantly, she understood what it would require. Not theatre. Not a dramatic entrance for its own sake. She had no patience for theatre. What Dario was describing was a surgical use of David's own stage, walking into a room where every person of consequence to VaxCore's future was assembled in one place with proof in hand, dressed in a way that made denial impossible. David had constructed the perfect venue for his own dismantling and sent her a cream-stock, embossed invitation to attend. "The board members," she said. "I need a full profile on each of them before we step foot in Florida. Investment history, risk tolerance, how they responded to the last 2 quarterly reports. If I'm going to walk into that room with the formula and the fraud documentation, I need to know which of them are already suspicious and which ones David has fully insulated. I'll have it within 72 hours. And the children, already handled?" He said it simply, which meant he had considered their presence before she had raised it. He had understood, without being told, that arriving with his family wasn't a liability to be managed, but a statement to be made. A man who brings his children to a reckoning is a man who is not planning to lose. Antonella picked up the invitation one final time. David's 5 words looked smaller now than they had 20 minutes ago. Handwriting, she had always thought, revealed the writer's assumptions. And these 5 words assumed she was still the woman sitting at a walnut desk in Houston, the hand moving toward a pen. She set it back down on the desk, face down. "I'll need 4 weeks, she said. "The legal documentation needs a second attorney review, and I want the formula independently verified by someone with FDA credentials before we walk through those doors." Dario nodded once. "Then we have exactly enough time." What neither of them said aloud, but both understood, was that the timeline David had set for his own celebration was about to become the timeline for something else entirely. In the adjacent room, the thermal array completed its overnight cycle with a soft, confirmatory tone, the formula holding perfect and stable, exactly as it had been designed to do. 3 days later, a package arrived from a couturier in New York's garment district. Antonella hadn't ordered it. There was no note inside. just a single structured gown in deep metallic fabric that caught the light like something armored, folded in layers of black tissue paper, with a small card bearing only an address in Miami and a date. Dario, it turned out, had also understood the dress. The gown fit as though it had been built around an intention rather than a body. Antonella stood in front of the full-length mirror in the Nevada facility's spare room. A mirror Petra had insisted on installing 3 weeks ago for reasons that had seemed purely logistical at the time, and now felt, in the particular way that children's instincts sometimes do, like foresight, and looked at herself with the same clinical precision she applied to everything. Not vanity, assessment. The metallic fabric moved like water that had decided to behave as armor. Structured through the shoulders, up precise at the waist, with the kind of construction that required a pattern maker who understood that the difference between a dress that looks expensive and a dress that communicates authority is entirely a question of how it holds its shape when the wearer is standing still. This one did not shimmer passively. It held the light the way a mirror holds it, by returning it, transformed. She had not worn anything like it in over 2 years. The quick-and-go uniform, the jeans and neutral sweaters she had lived in since Beaumont, clothes chosen for her invisibility, which had been the entire point. David had not only taken her patents and her name, he had trained her, through threat and through consequence, to move through space as though she were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with. Or she had not fully understood how completely she had internalized that training until she put on the gown and felt her first instinct was to take it off. Too much. Too visible. Too... there. She stood with that instinct for a moment and examined it the way she examined anomalous data. Not dismissing it, understanding its origin. It was not her instinct. It was his. A behavioral residue from a man who had found it strategically useful for her to believe that her own presence was a form of imposition. She did not take the gown off. Nico appeared in the doorway behind her, reflected in the mirror, his moleskin notebook tucked under one arm, and his father's particular quality of direct attention already fully developed at 9 years old. He studied the situation for a moment. "You look different," he said. Different how? He considered it with the seriousness he applied to structural calculations. Like when a building has the right foundation, you can just tell it's not going to move. She looked at his reflection for a moment. That is a very precise observation. Papa says precision is the only kind of observation worth making. He disappeared back down the hallway with the unbothered momentum of a child who had delivered his assessment and considered the matter complete. Dario arrived at the facility that afternoon with a garment bag, a woman named Celeste from a salon in downtown Reno, and the profile documents she had requested on the 4 Miami-based board members, printed, tabbed, and organized by the same color-coding system she had introduced in the quick-and-go stockroom, which meant he had been paying closer attention than she had realized. Celeste was efficient, unhurried, and had the specific gift of understanding when a client wanted to talk and when they wanted to be left inside their own head. She worked for 2 hours on Antonella's hair, not altering it precisely, but amplifying its natural architecture into something deliberate. Clean lines, structure without severity, the kind of result that reads as effortless because the effort has been so thoroughly concealed. While Celeste worked, Antonella read the board profiles. One name she lingered on: Theodore Marsh, a Palm Beach investor with a 22-year history of exiting positions the moment liability risk became visible, who had personally funded 2 FDA challenge petitions in the previous decade, and was, according to Dario's documentation, already asking quiet questions about VaxCore's Phase 3 timeline delays. Theodore Marsh was not David's ally. Theodore Marsh was a man waiting for a reason to move, which meant he was the first person she needed to reach when she walked through those cathedral doors. She was still reading when Dario appeared in the doorway of the spare room. He looked at her for a moment with the same neutralized expression he used when something confirmed an expectation he had kept to himself. Then he set the garment bag across the back of the chair and said simply, "The shoes are in the bag. Ferragamo. The heel height is practical enough to walk in quickly if the situation requires it." She looked up from the profile documents. "You planned for a fast exit. I planned for every contingency." A pause. "What, I also planned for the version where you don't need one." She held his gaze for a moment across the room. There was no performance in the exchange, no courtliness, just two people who had spent months learning to read each other accurately, acknowledging that the operation they had been building toward was now 4 days away, and that the distance between preparation and execution had finally collapsed to something real and immediate. "The legal documentation," she said. "Attorney review came back this morning. It's clean. And the independent formula verification? Complete. Dr. Augustine White. No relation. The coincidence is not lost on me. Verified the synthesis against the original patent filing. His written assessment is in the package." She set the board profiles down on the desk beside the gown's tissue wrapping. "David is going to walk into that ceremony believing he has already won. He has spent 5 years building a room full of people who believe the same thing. Yes," Dario said. "We are going to walk into that same room and make every single one of them understand, in real time, that what they believed was built on a theft." She said it without heat. Heat was for people who hadn't planned this carefully. There won't be a second chance at this moment. The documentation, the formula verification, the board member access, it all lands once, or it doesn't land. Dario nodded slowly. Then it lands once. Petra appeared from behind him, slipping under his arm with the practiced fluidity of a child who treats adults as landscape features rather than barriers, and looked at Antonella with enormous, unqualified approval. "But you look like the main character," she announced. Antonella glanced at her reflection. The gown, the structured lines, the woman looking back from the mirror, who was not apologizing for being visible. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly right." 4 days. 4 days and 400 miles southeast, in a white orchid cathedral on the edge of Biscayne Bay, David White was finalizing a seating chart, placing his investors carefully, arranging his narrative, positioning every element of an event he had designed to be witnessed and remembered. He had no idea he was setting her stage. Miami in December carries a particular quality of light, low and golden and slightly unreal, the kind that makes everything look like it was designed to be photographed. Well, the cathedral on the edge of Biscayne Bay had been built to receive exactly that light, its white stone facade catching the late afternoon sun and throwing it back at the arriving guests like a statement of intent. 500 people in black tie moved up the red-carpeted entrance path between velvet ropes and golden stanchions, the women in gowns that represented the combined output of ateliers from New York to Milan, the men in suits that cost more than most cars. David White had spent considerable money ensuring that his wedding looked like an inevitability. He had not spent enough. The teal Rolls-Royce pulled to the end of the approach road 4 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Yet at the precise moment, Antonella had calculated that the security detail would be at its most distributed, half stationed at the entrance, the other half already positioned inside, attention oriented toward the altar rather than the doors. Timing, like chemistry, was entirely a question of conditions. Dario stepped out first. He moved the way he always moved, without announcement, without performance, the natural authority of a man who has never needed a room's permission to enter it. The charcoal Brioni suit, the ink at his collar, the absolute, ambient stillness that had made half the guests at the cathedral's entrance go very quiet in a very specific way the moment they registered who had arrived. Then the children. Nico first, adjusting his jacket cuffs with the focused dignity of a 9-year-old who had been told this was an important occasion and had decided to treat it accordingly. The twins behind him, Petra and Luca in their matching black suits, each carrying a small cluster of helium balloons in pale gold and white, which they had selected themselves from a shop in Coral Gables that morning, and which Antonella had immediately understood was a perfect piece of theatre. Children with balloons at a wedding read as charming. Children with balloons also read as completely unthreatening, which meant every security eye that tracked them would be tracking the wrong thing. Antonella stepped out last. The metallic gown caught the Miami light and did exactly what it had been built to do. Not shimmer, not perform. To simply occupy the space with an authority that required no introduction. The entrance hall fell into a particular quality of attention as the 5 of them moved through it. David was already at the altar. She could see him through the open cathedral doors, positioned at the front of the aisle with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this specific image of himself. The moment the doors swung fully open and the gathered crowd registered what was walking through them, she watched his expression from 200 feet away complete its full journey from anticipation to confusion to something she could only describe as the first tremor of structural failure. She did not look at him again. She had approximately 8 minutes before the ceremony's formal proceedings would make disruption socially impossible, wherein she had 3 specific targets in the assembled crowd. Theodore Marsh was seated in the 3rd row on the right, Palm Beach investor. 22 years of preemptive exits, a man already asking questions. She reached him before the processional music had time to orient the room. The envelope she placed in his hands was slim, cream-colored, entirely unremarkable. Inside, 12 pages. Dr. Augustin's independent formula verification, the comparative analysis between Antonella's completed synthesis and the incomplete version currently in David's Phase 3 trial pipeline. The documented gap, the missing thermal stabilization sequence, rendered in language precise enough for a scientist and damning enough for a lawyer. "I'd read that before the vows," she said quietly. Marsh looked up at her. The recognition moved across his face. Not of her personally, but of the specific category of moment he was in. He had the expression of a man whose instincts had been correct for months and had just received their confirmation. He opened the envelope. Behind her, she was aware of Petra and Luca drifting with cheerful purposefulness toward the security personnel stationed along the side aisles, the balloons doing exactly the work she had anticipated, drawing hands and eyes, and the particular softening that large men in dark suits cannot entirely suppress when confronted with 6-year-olds offering balloon strings. Nico had positioned himself near the second cluster of board members and was doing something with his moleskin notebook that she suspected was considerably more strategic than it appeared. Or the second envelope went to Patricia Osei, a venture capital partner from Atlanta's Buckhead Corridor who had co-signed VaxCore's last 2 funding rounds, and whose name appeared 3 times in the liability assessment Dario's team had prepared. Patricia read the first page standing up, then sat down. The third went to Gerald Whitmore of Whitmore Bass Capital out of Charlotte, North Carolina, the board member with the most direct FDA relationships and therefore the most personal exposure if the flawed product ever reached approval. He read the cover page, turned to page 4, and reached for his phone. At the altar, David had stopped smiling. She was aware of him in her peripheral vision, the way you are aware of weather, not looking directly at it, but tracking its pressure. His best man had leaned in to say something. The officiant, a silver-haired man from a Coral Gables church who was visibly uncertain about the atmospheric shift moving through his congregation, had paused with his program open. Dario appeared at her side without her having seen him cross the room. That was another of his qualities she had stopped finding unsettling, the capacity to be precisely where the situation required him without visible transit. "Marsh just showed it to Osi," he said, low and even. "I know." She had watched the paper pass between them. "Whitmore's already drafting a text. I can tell by the typing posture. David is going to move in approximately 90 seconds. Let him." Because this was the part that David had not calculated in all his careful construction of this event, was in all his investor management and social architecture, and 5 words written across a cream-stock invitation. A public injunction had been filed in Miami-Dade County that morning, citing corporate fraud and intellectual property theft, with the formula verification and the original Houston transfer documents attached as evidence. It had been filed before the Rolls-Royce left the hotel, before the cathedral doors opened, before a single envelope changed hands. The wedding had never been the climax. The wedding was only the venue. David reached them before the 90 seconds were up, moving down the side aisle with the tight, controlled urgency of a man trying not to look like he was doing what he was doing. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing the specific calculation of someone reassessing every variable in real time. To Antonella, her name in his mouth, after 2 years, had a different weight than she remembered. Smaller, less structural. "Whatever you think you're doing, I filed this morning," she said. "Miami-Dade. The case number is on the last page of the document your investors are currently reading." David looked at Marsh, at Osei, at Whitmore, who had stood up and stepped into the aisle to speak quietly into his phone with the posture of a man conducting urgent damage control. The color that left David's face didn't return. From somewhere near the side aisle, Petra's voice rose with the uncomplicated delight of a child who had successfully released all her balloons simultaneously, sending them drifting in a pale gold cluster toward the cathedral's vaulted ceiling, while the security personnel around her looked upward with the helpless reflex of people who had been completely outmaneuvered by a 6-year-old. 500 people watched David White understand, at his own altar, in front of every investor and power broker he had spent 5 years assembling as witnesses to his invincibility, that the woman he had tried to bury had arrived with a shovel, a court filing, and considerably better timing than he had. Theodore Marsh stood up, looked at Antonella with the clean, decisive expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this permission. "I'll need your direct contact," he said, "before you leave today." The VaxCore building had not changed, yet that was the first thing Antonella noticed when the car turned onto the Houston street she had not driven down in 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Not that she had counted it as a number, only that the body keeps its own accounting of certain distances. The glass tower stood exactly as it had, catching the February morning light off the Texas sky, the company name still running in clean silver letters across the facade at the 15th floor. Her name had been removed from the building's directory 4 days after she signed the transfer papers in the rain. She had learned this from a former colleague who had mentioned it with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they hoped would not detonate. Today, the lobby directory had been corrected. She had not asked for that particular detail to be handled before her arrival. Someone on the transition team, she suspected Theodore Marsh, who had moved with the decisive efficiency of a man making up for 18 months of delayed instinct, had ensured it. The nameplate read simply, A. Ferrante, Chief Executive Officer. Her full name was coming. That was a conversation for the boardroom, and the boardroom was 4 minutes away. Dario held the lobby door, not in deference, in the specific way of someone who has decided that the old geometries, where they each occupied separate shadowed coordinates of the same world, no longer applied. He had been in Houston for 48 hours, mismanaging the cold chain logistics conversation with the newly reconstituted board, while Antonella completed the final documentation transfer with her legal team. The transition had moved with a speed that reflected the particular momentum of an empire whose foundation has been correctly identified as fraudulent, not collapsing exactly, but resolving itself rapidly back to its rightful architecture. David's arrest had come 16 days after Miami, on a Tuesday morning, federal agents meeting him outside a Brickell Avenue restaurant where he had been attempting to conduct what his attorney later described as a routine investor lunch. The charges included corporate fraud, intellectual property theft, and 3 counts related to the deliberate submission of incomplete clinical trial data to the FDA. Antonella had not watched the footage of the arrest. She had been in the Nevada lab at the time, completing the final verification sequence on the VaxCore synthesis, and she had not considered leaving to watch it. There was nothing in that footage she needed. The executive elevator opened onto the 15th floor with a soft, pneumatic exhale. The office had been cleared of David's particular aesthetic, the aggressive minimalism, the art chosen for impressiveness rather than meaning, the desk positioned to force visitors into a slightly unfavorable light, a detail she had always noticed and never commented on. What remained were the bones of the space she had originally designed before she had allowed someone to convince her it should look like someone else's idea of power. The walnut desk was already there, raw-edged, sourced from the same Austin workshop, the grain running in the same direction she remembered. She had not ordered it. Standing in the doorway, looking at it, she understood that Dario had not ordered it either. This was Nico's work. She had mentioned the original desk once, in passing, during a late Nevada evening, when the conversation had moved into the territory that conversations move into when 2 people have spent enough months being honest with each other about everything except the things that matter most. Nico had been at the far end of the bench, doing his structural calculations, apparently absorbed. Apparently. She stood at the window for a moment before sitting down. Houston spread below her in every direction. The medical center complex to the south, the green corridor of Herman Park, the sprawl of a city that had been, at various points in her life, the location of her greatest work and her most complete destruction. Standing here now, at the same altitude she had occupied before everything was taken, the view looked neither triumphant nor painful. It looked like what it was, a city that had continued existing regardless of what happened to her inside it, and which would now host a different chapter of the same story. She sat down behind the walnut desk. The weight of it was exactly as she remembered. Dario moved to the window she had just left, looking out over the city with his hands in the pockets of his charcoal jacket, the Houston skyline framed against a winter sky that had decided, for once, to be clear. No rain, the particular relief of a day that makes no atmospheric demands. "What, the cold chain conversation with Marsh's team went well this morning," he said. "I know. He messaged me before the car arrived. He wants a formal agreement before the end of Q1. He'll have it." She opened the first folder on the desk, the VaxCore commercialization timeline, the document she had been building toward since the night she mixed cleaning products in a Beaumont stockroom and quietly changed the trajectory of everything. The Phase 3. Submission goes to the FDA on the 14th. Dr. Augustin is co-signing the verification package. A pause settled over the room that was not uncomfortable. They had spent enough time working in parallel silence that its quality was familiar, productive, inhabited. The silence of two people who had stopped needing to fill space with noise some months ago. "Petra wants to know if she can visit the Houston lab," Dario said. Antonella looked up from the folder. "She asked you, or she asked me?" "She asked me because she assumed I'd be a softer point of entry." The corner of his mouth moved. She was incorrect. "Tell her yes. Tell her she has to bring the notebook and take real notes, not just drawings of the equipment. She'll take that as a formal invitation and hold you to it." "Good." Outside the window, a hawk was working a thermal above the park, wide circles at altitude, entirely unbothered by the city turning beneath it. Antonella watched it for a moment. She thought about the Quick and Go sign with its burned-out letter, the fluorescent hum, the 22x46 world she had lived inside for 14 months. She thought about the rain in Houston, the manila folder, for the brass clasp, the pen placed on her desk with a small, deliberate click. She thought about the woman whose hand had moved toward that pen, and the distance between that woman and the one currently sitting behind the desk that had always, in every version of this story, been hers. Not far, as distances go. Not far at all. The same mind, the same hands, the same thermal sequencing solution that had lived only inside her head, regardless of what any document said about who owned it. The difference was simply this. She was no longer making herself small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of what she was allowed to be. She turned to the second document in the folder. "There's one more thing," Dario said. He turned from the window and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, placing a single item on the corner of the walnut desk with the same deliberate, quiet motion she recognized from 2 years ago, in a different context, in a different city, with a very different object. But the gesture, the thing placed precisely, the waiting, was new. A key, polished, modern, attached to a small tag with an address in Houston's River Oaks neighborhood. She looked at it, then at him. "The children need a city base when they're not in Nevada," Dario said. His voice was entirely measured, which meant he was working to keep it that way. "River Oaks is 12 minutes from this building. The property has a garden room with northern light exposure that the realtor described as suitable for a home laboratory, which I took as a reasonable sign." Antonella looked at the key for a long moment, at the address on the tag, at the man standing across her desk who had walked into a Beaumont convenience store with a bottle of water and a proposition and had spent every month since treating her intelligence as the most valuable and uncompromised thing in his operational world. She picked up the key. 12 minutes is acceptable," she said. Through the glass, the hawk broke out of its thermal circle and angled south over the city in a long, direct line, no longer circling, no longer waiting on the air, simply moving in full light toward whatever came next.